Okay, so today we're going to finish learning about psychological assessments, and just to just so that we're all on the same page, I am going to briefly go over what we've already learned from this chapter, and then we'll continue from there. Okay, so when it comes to abnormal psychology, one of the first steps is obviously going to be getting an assessment. So, what is a psychological assessment, right? A psychological assessment they're basically measurement techniques where people give you info that you score, and that score will tell you a lot about their cognitive function, meaning their brain. Okay, so that's what a psychological assessment is. You get answers from people to see what's going on with their brain. And a good assessment has to be two things. It has to be reproducible and accurate. So these are terms in psychology that you'll learn very early on. So it has to be reliable. That's what it means by reproducible. No matter who the clinician is that gives these assessments, they should come up with the same answer. That's what reliability is, okay? And the good assessment also has to be accurate, meaning it has to be valid. So it's the degree to which the test is actually testing what it intends to test. So for example, if I give you an IQ test, but some of the questions are more personality based than IQ, that's not very valid, right? Like when I get the responses, it's not really going to be valid because it's not really testing IQ. So that's what a psychological assessment is used for, and it's got to have those two things. You need to be able to reproduce it. No matter who you are, if I do it or you do it or someone else does it, they should be able to get the same answer, reliability, and it has to actually test what it's trying to test. Okay, it has to be valid. There are a ton of different types of psychological assessments. Employers can give psychological assessments to see if you're like a good fit for the position. Have you guys, write down in the chat if you guys have ever applied to a job and part of the test was to take one of those personality tests, like have you ever been in a situation when this happens, or a situation? Okay, so employers can do personality tests. I mean psychological assessment, sorry. One psychological assessment is actually a personality test, since I mentioned it. Another one can be an IQ test. Another psychological assessment can be actually a clinician interview. Like if you guys have ever gone in to speak to a therapist, for example, that discussion that you have with them initially where they're asking questions, that's considered a clinician interview. There's forensic assessment where basically legal decisions will be made depending on the psychologist's findings. And there's also obviously diagnostic assessment, which is what you and I are probably thinking when we hear about psychological assessments, right? We're basically assessing, like, does this person seem to fit a set of things that will allow me, or that will lead me to believe that maybe they're, like, let's use me for example. I have ADHD, that they have ADHD. Okay. Something very important, I know that a lot of us like to take all these fun little quizzes online, but psychological assessments, the more valid, accurate, reliable, whatever, the more that you want it to be those things, the more that you should consider doing standardized testing. So standardized basically means that it's the same for everyone, okay? Like if I ask you, how many chickens do you have? And based on this answer, I'm supposed to come up, or whatever. I have to ask the other person the same thing. How many chickens do you have? I can't be like, so how many chickens do you have? No. It has to be worded exactly the same. It has to be standard, okay? Not only do the words have to be standardized, the responses have to be standardized. There has to be only a certain set of categories that you can pick. For example, if you're taking a multiple choice question test and it has, each question gives you 4 options to choose from. It's giving you categorized answers. You can only pick from those 4 categorized answers. Okay, so that's what makes a good psychological assessment. Additionally, the psychologist has to be knowledgeable. They have to be thorough, and they've got to be objective. Like, if you have a psychologist who's just like, everyone, is crazy, like, they're not going to be objective. You need somebody who's objective. They don't have like preconceived notions of you. They're not going in there thinking you might have this, you might have that, or like, actually, someone with your hair color doesn't have that problem. No. You need someone who's objective. Objective means that no matter who sees it, when, where, whatever, everybody's getting the same result, like science. Okay? So standardization is important in psychological assessments because it basically ensures that things will be administered correctly. So it has to have clear, specified directions, how to administer the test, instructions on how to score it. Everything needs to be clear. Okay, that's one of like those are the characteristics of having a standardized psychological assessment. If I tell you, draw a clock, and then I tell someone else, draw a clock 10 minutes past 11, that's not fair, right? If they drew 10 minutes past 11 and I didn't tell you to draw 10 minutes past 11, I'm going to be like, oh, you didn't do as well as them. It has to be exactly the same. Anyway, so there are such things as fallacies, and so psychology is actually a scientific field. I know a lot of people don't consider it to be, or don't know that. I didn't, but it is. And so there are a lot of fallacies, like for example, there's this effect that they in psychology like to call the Barnum effect. It's basically vague statements. Like, you guys remember, was it Barnum Circus or Barnum something? If you guys remember, put it in the chat. But basically, they used to have this saying that, we've got something for everyone. So in psychology, we want to avoid any statements that can apply to anyone. Okay? For example, like, if somebody's like, well, sometimes you're social, but other times when you're really close to people, you provide a lot more, sensitive, detailed information about yourself. That literally applies to anyone, right? So if it's generally applicable, we don't want that in psychology. We call that fallacies, okay? And basically, a lot of people like tarots and horoscopes and stuff, and that's totally fine. But the thing is that when it comes to psychology, statements like that are not helpful, okay, because they're too easily generalized. So let's talk about a type of assessment. A type of psychological assessment are clinical interviews. And I think that, when we think of clinical interviews, we think of, for example, going in, talking to a therapist, and he, whatever, is reading down a list. Do you ever consider self-harm? Have you ever purged after eating? They read off this list. That's called a structured clinical interview. Structured clinical interview is basically a series of questions that are already pre-written, they're already pre-made, and the clinician is reading them to the client, word for word. It's very important that you guys know that when you're taking a test, survey, whatever, the words that are in those questions, they are meticulously chosen. meticulously. So, like I said, they're meticulously chosen. So they have a predetermined wording and order. So I can't read question number 1 and then go to question number 3 and go back to 2 if for everyone else I read it in the order of question 1, question 2, question 3. That's not fair. It's not right. That wouldn't be a properly conducted, structured clinical interview. So the things that clinical interviews will help a clinician with is to really classify your symptoms, and classifying your symptoms will help them diagnose what the problem is. So there's also unstructured clinical interviews. Unstructured clinical interviews are when you go in, you sit down with the therapist, and they're like, so tell me, what brings you in here? Oh, okay. Oh, and pardon, did you say your husband dropped you off? Okay, so you're married. How long have you been married? It's more conversational. They're not reading it off a script, right? So that's unstructured. So there are 2 clinical interview types, structured and unstructured. Clinicians can switch between them, throughout a sesh, okay? Also, the standard clinical interview is called the SCID-5, and you guys, they're long. They take about 45 to 90 minutes to complete. So when it comes to unstructured questions, these are your typical open-ended questions, asking what your symptoms are. They want to know your health history. They want to know your family background, your personal life history. Because, for example, let's say you're coming in and you're like, I'm just so depressed, right? Let's say they're trying to see okay, so this is going to be my target. I'm going to try to target this depression. But then we start finding out oh, so are you married? Actually, my spouse recently passed away in a horrific car accident. Or right now I'm married, but we actually lost our house. That will give the clinician insight and context as to what's going on in your life. So let's see what else. You should know that when you are getting a psychological assessment, when you're dealing with a clinical interview, they are recording what you're saying, but they're not only recording what you're saying, they're observing. They're observing your mood and your affect. Your mood is what you feel inside. Okay, for example, let's take today for example. I had a meltdown. Okay, so I was extremely dysregulated. But that's what I'm feeling inside. But my affect is what I show, my exterior, what I'm showing to the world. So my affect is, I'm studious, I'm learning, I'm absorbing information, right? They're going to record that. They're going to record your nonverbal cues. If you're talking and all of a sudden, you discuss a topic that your body was wide open, and then they're going to write that down. They're going to write down, if they see anxiety, if they see attention difficulties, they're going to write down your appearance, okay? And that's very important. They are going to write down your emotional state. They're going to write down your interpersonal skills. All of those things. For example, when I started going to my therapist, she very quickly was like, I think you have ADHD. I talk fast. I jump from topic to topic. It was just she was observing all of that, okay? Develop rapport. So another thing that they want to do during your clinical interview is develop a relationship with you. They want to have a ping pong back and forth conversation, rapport. They want to build up this trust. They want you to feel cared about. They want you to feel supported. So they want to build rapport. So that is one of the psychological assessments. Okay. Another psychological assessment is called a mental status examination. And this is basically a method of assessing the client's behavior and functions. So the assessment has a number of factors. They are going to look at your appearance. They are going to look at your attitude. They're going to look at your behavior, your mood and affect. Wait a minute. Do they look at mood and affect in clinical interview? Yes. They're going to look at your speech, your rate of speech. Are you having trouble accessing words? Are you speaking very quickly? They're going to write down your thought process. Oh, it jumps from topic to topic to topic. They're going to write down the content of your thoughts. Very pessimistic, very critical of themselves, like, wow, thinks that they're perfect, delusions of grandeur. They're going to write down your perception. How do you perceive things? Your cognition, which is basically like how are you thinking abilities. They're going to write down what your insight and judgments are. Like, are you the kind of person who's constantly judging everybody else? Are you judging yourself? Do you not judge anyone? Are you completely unaware of your surroundings, right? So during a mental status examination, they're going to be looking at this. For example, if you come in, you're depressed, smelly, your shoelace is not even tied, obviously your clothes are smelly, like you're trembling, like you can barely talk, you can't remember words, you have no energy, they're going to write that down. And it's important because 2 months from now, if that's what you're always like, that's your baseline. 2 months from now, if you're at the edge of your seat and you got a bunch of piercings and you're a whole different person and you stay like that for a while, okay, they're going to know it's like that's not like their baseline. So it's important. So when clinicians are examining you for your mental status, it's not because they're like gossiping or being petty or anything. It's because they need to get a sense of what your normal is and what isn't normal, what is going on that maybe you don't recognize that maybe they can help you with. Okay. So when it comes to mood and affect, this is very important. Us as humans, we all do these. Mood is obviously what we feel inside. Affect is what we show to people, okay? When it comes to mood, there are 3 that basically you can be. Euthymic, which is normal. You're not happy, you're not sad, you're just existing, right? And then the other one is dysphoric, which is your energy level is super low. You are having unpleasant feelings, dysphoric, okay? Euphoric means high energy, extreme elation. Elation is like happiness, excitement, joy, exuberance, dynamic. So they're going to look at these 3 moods. They're going to be like, it looks like their mood is this, right? Affect is, once again, what you show on the outside. And that's very important for them to notice. Because if they can tell you're in a certain mood, but you're trying so hard to put on a brave mask or like act like everything's okay, they're also going to notice that. Okay, so they're going to be like, client feels sad but acts happy. That's heavy. That must be tough. Dude, it sucks when you feel like you can't be your authentic self, Okay, so another psychological assessment is intelligence testing, and I know we all love these. And I know you've probably thought that you've taken an intelligence test before. Intelligence tests are long, and they are incredibly specific, standardized. So let's talk about intelligence testing. Clinicians can obtain standardized information that will help them evaluate a client's strengths and weaknesses. Thanks, babe. So some of the things that will be evaluated on an intelligence test are your cognitive evaluation skills, any learning disabilities, determination of giftedness, prediction of academic achievement, diagnosis of neurological disorders. So there are a lot of things that, clinicians use intelligence tests for. And they're used by more than just clinicians. Okay, so let's talk about the stuff we all want to know. Okay, so they've decided to make 100, an IQ of 100, the average intelligence score. Okay, so with a standard deviation of 15, anyone with an IQ less than 72 is considered intellectually disabled, and anyone with an IQ higher than 130 is, those are your Mensa people, which is so funny because in Spanish that means dumb girl. Anyway. Okay, so let's talk about mental status examination again. So possible symptoms are inappropriate affect. So fails to correspond to content, meaning like, okay, if you are going through something horrible, but somehow your affect is like, you're still bright and cheerful and everything's perfect, something's not matching. Like your affect is not matching reality. Okay? Or blunted or flat affect. If somebody is seeing a clinician and during their mental status examination they respond like this, they don't have much going on in their face, that is not normal. Humans don't do that. Humans are expressive, their eyes, mouth, everything. So if that happens, they're having minimal or absent, like basically low energy. There's also such a thing as heightened affect, which is exaggerated or dramatic. Decreased mobility, which is slow to have emotions. That's also something that could be a possible symptom of whatever it is that they're coming in complaining about. Excessive mobility, which is rapid emotional shifts. So it's kind of like misleading, right? Because it's decreased mobility and rapid mobility. You'd think would be about like body movement, but it's not. It's actually about your emotions. Or having a restricted range of emotions, like they basically only show anger or calmness, like no happiness, no nerves, no nothing, right? Okay, so in regards to deviation intelligence quotient, that's just basically another word for IQ. And it's saying that the index of intelligence is derived from comparing an individual's score with the mean score of that person's reference group. Meaning, for example, I'm 35, female, got a bachelor's degree. So if I took an IQ test, they would compare my score with the mean score of 35, female, grad school, stuff like that. Initially, the deviation intelligence quotient, the IQ test, was actually started because they wanted to find students that needed additional support. Obviously, now it's grown into something that, has a multitude of uses. So you get a deviation IQ by dividing your score with the mean score of, your reference group. So 50% of people will have an IQ higher than 100, and 50% of people will have an IQ lower than 100, and that's totally normal. Most people's IQ will be between 85 and 115. Um, Standard deviation is 15. So if you get 115 as your IQ, you are above average, because the average is between 85 and 116, not including 85 and 116. If you get an IQ score lower than 86, if you get an 85 IQ score, your IQ is below average. Okay? So above average intelligence is basically any score greater than 84% of your reference group. So that would be anybody who scores 115 or more. So there are different types of intelligence tests. There's the Stanford Binet intelligence test. It gives you an overall IQ score, but it also scores for different scales. It scores for fluid reasoning, which is basically like how quickly you can adapt your problem solving skills. They scale for knowledge, which is how much accumulated fundamentals of general information. I don't know. So how much accumulated general information have you stored? Quantitative reasoning, quantity, numbers. This is your ability to problem solve with numbers, to think numerically, to understand numerical concepts. Visual spatial reasoning. This is the ability to analyze spatial relationships and geometric shapes. Okay? They also, one of the scales for the Stanford Binet intelligence test is my personal struggle in life, working memory. What is your ability, which basically means what's your ability to store information, to transform information, and to retrieve information in the short term. Okay, so if you have ADHD, you likely have impairments there, which I do. There's also the Wechsler Intelligence Scale, and that one also does full-scale IQ testing and has subcategories. The Wechsler Intelligence Scale is the first intelligence test that was actually designed for adults. Now they have one for teens and kids. Okay. Neuroimaging is basically where they can look at a picture of your brain. And when it comes to all these things, how does a clinician put it all together? So what they do is they combine the results from your assessment, your clinical interview, your, self, your, what's it called? What you've told them you're dealing with or whatever, and any diagnostic criteria. And so they come up with a diagnosis or a potential diagnosis. So that's how it goes with psychological assessments. I guess I still have a few questions about it because I'm learning and I'm just like doing this to review. Let's see. So, I actually didn't finish reading chapter 3, so I'm going to finish reading chapter 3 right now. Okay, another assessment that they do are psychological assessments. Behavioral assessments, okay? A behavioral assessment is a form of measurement based on objective recording of the individual's behavior. Unlike psychological tests, behavioral assessments record actions rather than responses to rating scales or questions. Okay, so for example, if you were to take a personality test, they'd be like, which one of these sound more like you? mean to nice. Pick, the number on the scale. Whereas like behavioral assessments, they are watching how you behave. And that is something that a school psychologist would conduct. They would go sit in the classroom and be a little wallflower and watch the child's behavior without the child noticing. That way they can see what the child is actually like on, a day-to-day basis in their natural environment. So in a behavioral assessment, the target behavior is the behavior of interest or concern. And it's what the client or clinician wants to change. Let's see. Behavioral assessments include descriptions of the antecedents or events that precede the behaviors and consequences. So for example, if, I have a school psychologist in my class studying, a specific child. Let's say it's a girl. And everything's always fine, but for whatever reason, right after recess, every single time, she has a meltdown. But she doesn't have a meltdown after lunch. That's an antecedent that they're going to record in a behavioral assessment, okay? And they're also going to record the consequences. What were the consequences of their behavior? So when she had a meltdown, what were the consequences? And what were the outcomes? So let's see. A behavioral self-report is a method of behavioral assessment in which the individual provides info about the frequency of particular behaviors. Self-monitoring is probably the one that we know about the most. It's like keeping a record of like the frequency of your behavior. Like, oh, today I drank 2 coffees. Like, today I had 3 cookies. Like that. Clinicians can also obtain information from their clients using behavioral interviewing. In behavioral interviews, they'll ask you questions about your targeted behaviors frequency. So if you go in because you're dealing with anxiety, they're going to try to find out how frequent that is. What's the antecedent, meaning what happens before you get anxiety? And what are the consequences afterwards, right? So they also these days want to be very culturally aware, so they do multicultural assessments as well. And these basically take into account a person's culture, a person's ethnicity, and a person's race. And so the cultural formulation interview is basically a set of questions that assesses the impact of your culture on key aspects of how you are presenting, how you are taking care of yourself, okay? It assesses the client's cultural identity. Like for me, I'm Hispanic, but culturally, I'm American. I was born and raised here, right? Even though I'm still Hispanic, that still plays a factor. That would be different from like an American who maybe just moved here like 10 years ago. Like their culture might be heavily influenced by their previous country that they lived in. So the CFI assesses the client's cultural identity, the individual's cultural conceptualizations of distress, the way the client's culture defines vulnerability and resilience, and any cultural differences between the client and clinician. This is very important. The cultural formulation interview is not just for you, the client. It is also for your clinician. They have to be aware, for me, as a Hispanic person, I show my emotions a lot more than, for example, if I had an East Indian client. So just because they're not expressing emotions as much as I would, I can't judge them based on the same metric as me because we're from different cultures. So it's very important to take that into account. Questions on the CFI include, what are the most important aspects of your background or identity? Why do you think this is happening to you? Okay, so when somebody asks background or identity, they basically refer to the communities that you belong to, languages you speak, where you're from, where your family is from, your race, ethnic background, gender, sexual orientation, faith, religion. They also sometimes clinicians will also use technology to assess your degree of acculturation. Okay? It's important for clinicians to ensure that the assessment instruments provide multicultural normative data to assist in the interpretation of scores. So I actually don't know what acculturation is, so I'm going to ask Google. Okay, Google, define acculturation.
Here's the definition of acculturation: assimilation to a different culture, typically the dominant one.
Oh, okay. Why would somebody use acculturation versus assimilation? Not like in a mean way, I just actually want to know what the difference is because they sound like synonyms. Anyway, to ensure that their assessments meet current multicultural assessment criteria, clinicians can seek continuing education. For example, if someone is conducting assessment tests that they learned when they were in school 35 years ago, could they still work? Potentially. But sometimes maybe there's been so much new research, so many updates, so many whatever, that it's no longer relevant. So it's really important for them to continue staying up to date, okay, in their field. New instruments are being developed to evaluate the extent to which clients believe their clinicians are meeting their needs for culturally informed assessment and treatment. Another assessment that is done in psychology is what's called a neuropsychological assessment. Those are basically assessments that are performance-based. So they assess the cognitive functioning. Neuropsychological assessment is a performance-based method assessing cognitive functioning that clinicians use to understand the cognitive consequences of brain damage, brain disease, and severe mental illness. So, for example, if you had an accident and hit your head, and after you hit your head, you have a completely different personality, you're going to have a neuropsychological assessment. Okay, they want to know what impact that that trauma, that blunt force to your head, had on your cognitive abilities. The assessment consists of a set of tests that clinicians draw from to measure a variety of cognitive functions, things such as attention, memory, processing speed, verbal reasoning, comprehension, visual reasoning, verbal memory, visual memory, basically everything having to do with your brain, right? They also have scales from basically like established measures of intelligence tests, and those will help them assess your verbal recall, your auditory attention. So a lot of IQ tests are used for things that are not solely to determine your IQ. Okay, they have various purposes, and there are a lot of tests that evaluate executive functioning. So for here, they define executive functioning as the ability to formulate goals, make plans to achieve them, carry those goals out, and finish the plan in an effective way. So let's see what else. There are brief screening tests for like mini mental state examinations. Let's just read what those are. A clinician may conduct a brief neuropsychological assessment for the purposes of screening for neurocognitive disorders. These tools are intended not to lead to a diagnosis, but instead to guide the neuropsychologist to next steps in a more thorough assessment. This is very interesting. Researchers are developing assessment instruments that combine elements of these brief screening scales, potentially allowing for greater precision in the screening process. Many mental state examinations, they're a structured tool that clinicians use as a brief screening device to assess neurocognitive disorders. Its original purpose was to serve as a quickly administered test that a clinician could administer to individuals who might not be able to complete a full neuropsychological exam. I have to be careful not to confuse neurological with neuropsychological. Questions on the MMSE ask the test taker to follow instructions. Remember a set of 3 unrelated items. Copy a picture and name the current date and location. Damn, that's a lot. Although widely used for initial neurocognitive screening, the MMSE cannot identify the cause of a neurocognitive disorder. Moreover, it's not designed to be administered to individuals who can't read or write the language of the exam, and it is biased toward people with greater than an 8th grade education. These limitations mean that the MMSE may not always be appropriate, whether used alone or in combination with other cognitive tests. The Montreal Cognitive Assessment, MoCA, is a second brief cognitive screening device. It's designed for use by a wide range of clinicians, ranging from nurses to psychologists, in the detection of potential cognitive impairment. The MoCA contains a set of short tasks ranging from exhibiting short recall of the names of objects to drawing the face of an analog clock. Compared to the MMSE, the MoCA appears to have fewer limitations in terms of its applicability to individuals of varying educational levels. Versions of the MoCA for use with non-English speaking populations are becoming increasingly available, including in Portuguese, Turkish, Chinese, and French. Now let's discuss neuropsychological assessments for executive functioning. And these are brief screenings, okay? So these are not full-blown, they're not diagnostic. They just kind of lead your clinician to kind of the right path, give them an idea of what other sort of assessments you may need. So moving now into tests that tap specific areas of neurological impairment, so brain functioning impairment, those that assess executive function, prefrontal lobe, rely on abilities that require decision making, abstraction, and planning, because that's what your prefrontal lobe, your frontal cortex, is supposed to be able to do, like a healthy, mature frontal cortex. These key functions are essential in everyday life, and deficits revealed by neurocognitive tests can assist both in diagnosing and in helping to plan treatment for individuals who score below the range of normal functioning. There's also the trail making test. This is one of the tests for executive functioning. The trail making test is a widely used, simple test of executive functioning, assessing the ability to trace a path among a set of related stimuli. Look at this. It looks very easy, right? You would just go from 1 to 2, 2 to 3, and so on. It gets more difficult though. Although originally designed as a paper and pencil measure, it can now be administered on a tablet. Okay, so, we're growing. So what I just showed you is a sample of a trail making test, part A. So in this sample, the task is to draw a line connecting the numbers in order. It may seem simple, but to individuals with damage to the prefrontal lobe of their brain, they may actually find it challenging. And the abilities tapped into by the trail making test include paying attention, scanning visual stimuli, and sequencing numbers. So another executive functioning test is the clock drawing test. This is also used for dementia, neurocognitive abilities. There's a large number of instruments that measure visuospatial ability. One very simple test used in screening for neurocognitive impairment is the clock drawing test. The examiner gives the individual being tested gives the individual being tested a sheet of paper with a large pre-drawn circle on it. The client's task is to draw the numbers around the circle to look like the face of an analog clock. Finally, the examiner asks the client to draw the hands of the clock to read 10 after 11. The clinician then rates the client's drawing according to the number of errors. The most impaired clients are unable to reproduce a clock face at all, or they make mistakes in writing the numbers or placing them around the clock. Like the TMT, the clock drawing test can also be administered using digital tools, including a digital pen. The Wisconsin card sorting test taps the client's ability to form higher order abstract concepts. Its basic premise is that individuals with deficits in executive functioning will be unable to form these concepts, but also show difficulty when having to switch from one set of concepts to another. A typical trial in the Wisconsin card sorting test is here in figure 4. Okay? The clinician reveals one card at a time, and the client's job is to indicate which of the cards in the top row matches this card. There are 64 cards in the series. In the example shown here, the 2 red plus signs could match either card 1 because of color, card 2 because of number, or card 4 because of shape. The test taker receives feedback about whether the choice was correct or not. On the next trial, this feedback would inform the client's choice of card. After several trials, the concept shifts, and now the client must discover the new rule. The test was originally developed using physical cards, but now clinicians typically administer the test in computerized format. Brain imaging data support the ability of the WCST to tap into the functioning of the prefrontal areas of the brain. Researchers are expanding its use internationally through publication of normative data from countries such as Argentina, Portugal, and Lebanon. How long is this chapter? The Paced Auditory Serial Addition Test, PASAT, assesses the components of executive function involved in auditory information processing speed, flexibility, and calculation ability. Paced Auditory Serial Addition Test assesses components of executive function involved in auditory information processing speed, flexibility, and calculation ability. The client hears a recording of numbers between 1 and 9 every 3 seconds. The task is to add the number just heard with the number that preceded it. If the recording was 135267, the correct response would be 487813. In addition to assessing traumatic brain injury, the PASAT also serves to test the function of individuals with multiple sclerosis because it appears to tap areas of the brain affected by this disease. This is fascinating, and this is going in my study guide. Neuropsychological assessments. There's nobody in there but you, my love.
Chiquita.
Babe, I am on live. I mean, it doesn't matter. Nobody's there, but.
Chiquita, that was nasty. What did you eat?
Okay, trail making test. To detect potential. cognitive impairments. Okay.
Yeah.
Trail making test. Wait.
I'm running on empty.
Go eat, babe.
I already did eat.
Okay. Then they have the clock drawing test.
I need a ghost. Or at least a monster.
Okay, babe, do your thing. And then they also have the Wisconsin card sorting test. Wisconsin card sorting test. Wisconsin card sorting test. Higher order abstract concepts. Ability to form higher order abstract concepts. I think clock drawing is for cognitive impairment. Let's see. Visual spatial ability. Visual spatial. What, my love?
You got something on your cheek?
What, a kiss?
I got it.
So executive functioning, tap the area of neurological impairment Moving now into tests that tap specific areas of neurological impairment. Those that assess executive functioning rely on abilities. Okay. Areas that assess neurological impairment. What does this mean, babe? It says, moving now into tests that tap specific areas of neurological impairment, those that assess executive functioning rely on abilities that require decision-making, abstraction, and planning. So basically it's saying that to test executive function, the test will have to rely on decision-making, abstraction, and planning. Like, that's what they use to test executive function, right?
Yeah. Makes sense to me.
Decision making, abstraction, and planning. Man, I feel like the prefrontal cortex, executive functioning, is in charge of literally like everything. Okay. The paced auditory serial addition test. Paced auditory serial addition test, which is the PASAT, P-A-S-A-T. So this test assesses components of executive function, involved in auditory information processing speed, Man, I'm gonna need a new pen soon. Oh, hold on. Flexibility and calculation ability. That's true because I have impaired executive functioning and sometimes I can't be flexible. Like I actually have like an extremely difficult time if I'm focused on something, trying to focus on other things. And I actually, anecdote, I just had like a little breakdown because of that earlier today. Because I have a hard time being flexible sometimes, which is ironic because most of the problem is that I'm too flexible, right? Anyway, the client hears a recording of numbers between 1 and 9. In addition to assessing traumatic brain injury, the placement also serves to test the functioning of individuals with multiple sclerosis. So it also tests traumatic brain injury and multiple sclerosis. Okay, what else? Other neuropsychological tests are the Boston Naming Test, neuropsychological test that assesses word retrieval abilities. Okay. Boston Naming Test. So this assesses word retrieval. Are you driving there?
No, I'm walking.
Are you sure, babe? It's super hot. Like really hot.
Yeah.
Okay, love you, bye. Be safe. So this assesses the word retrieval abilities of children with learning disabilities and adults who've suffered brain damage. So children with learning disabilities and adults with brain damage. Each of the 60 items on the BNT contains a picture of an object, and the test taker must retrieve its name. The BNT moves from simple items such as bed, tree, and pencil to difficult items at the end, such as palette and abacus. Huh? I don't even know what's an abacus? Like, how do you draw a palette? Like, oh my god. Incorrect answers include the individual's failure to name the item, but also to give a related name. Mouth organ for harmonica. Or to name only a part of the item. Originally written in English for native English speakers, the BNT is now available in a number of translations. Yet, clinicians should interpret BNT scores with caution among bilingual adults. Furthermore, even in native English-speaking populations, clinicians should be familiar with potential threats to validity in applying the BNT to non-white test takers. Literally, I'm like Exhibit A. I'm like, what is an abacus? Like, what? But if I asked my white husband, I'm sure he would know. Let's see what else. Used to assess immediate aftermath of brain trauma, the Glasgow Coma Scale measures impairment of conscious level in response to defined stimuli. Other neuropsychological tests investigate a variety of memory functions. The Wechsler Memory Scale, 4th edition, includes tests of working memory, which is short-term memory, and long-term memory for visual and verbal stimuli. And when they're testing older adults, they can use different scales. And let's see what else. Adaptive testing is testing in which the client's responses to earlier questions determine the subsequent questions presented to him or her. Cambridge Neuropsychological Testing Automated Battery is a computerized neuropsychological test battery offering 22 specific tests. Okay, let's talk about neuroimaging. Neuroimaging Assessment method that provides a picture of the brain's structure or level of activity and therefore is a useful tool for looking at the brain. So it's a picture that shows you the brain and its activity. And electroencephalogram and EEG measure the change in electrical activity of the brain. Where are my notes? Because I know I wrote that somewhere. Oh, I did it at school. A CAT scan or a CT scan, they're a series of x-rays taken from various angles around the brain that are integrated by a computer to produce a composite picture. MRIs use radio waves rather than x-rays to construct a static picture of the living brain based on the water content to various tissues. A PET scan is a measure of brain activity in which a small amount of radioactive compounds is injected into an individual's bloodstream, following which a computer measures the varying levels of radiation in different parts of the brain and yields a multicolored image. Far out. A SPECT scan, a variant of the PET scan that allows a longer and more detailed imaging analysis to be performed. An MRS, a scanning method that measures metabolic activity of neurons and therefore may indicate areas of brain damage. An fMRI provides a picture of how areas of the brain react to stimuli in real time. Whereas an MRI is a static picture of the living brain. An fMRI measures metabolic activity of neurons. An MRI provides a picture of how areas of the brain. Okay, fMRI is like a functioning MRI. Like, how is the brain reacting? Whereas like the MRI, it's a picture of the living brain. Okay, and the last one is diffusion tensor imaging, DTI. It's a method to investigate abnormalities in the white matter of the brain. Alrighty, so that's pretty much it for the assessment chapter of abnormal psychology. I am going to read the summary here so we can put everything together and synthesize the information. In summary, a psychological assessment is a procedure in which a clinician provides a formal evaluation of an individual's cognitive, personality, and psychosocial functioning. Clinicians conduct assessments under a variety of conditions. In many cases, clinicians use the assessment process to provide a diagnosis, or at least a tentative diagnosis, of an individual's psychological disorder. To be useful, clinicians must hold assessments to standards that ensure that they provide the most reproducible and accurate results. The reliability of a test indicates the consistency of the scores it produces. The test's validity reflects the extent to which a test measures what it's designed to measure. Clinicians should use the best assessment methods possible. Evidence-based assessments include 1. Relying on research findings and scientifically viable theories. 2. Using psychometrically strong measures. And 3. Empirically evaluating the assessment process. The clinical interview is a series of questions that clinicians administer in face-to-face interaction with the client. The answers the client provides to these questions provide important background information on clients, allow them to describe their symptoms, and enable clinicians to make observations of their clients that can guide decisions about the next step, which may include further testing. The format of clinical interviews can be structured or unstructured. A clinician uses a mental status examination to assess a client's current state of mind. The clinician assesses a number of features of the client, including appearance, attitudes, behavior, mood and affect, speech, thought processes, content of thought, perception, cognition, insight, and judgment. The outcome of the mental status examination is a comprehensive description of how the client looks, thinks, feels, and behaves. Intelligence tests, such as the Stanford Binet Intelligence Test, but particularly the Wechsler scales, provide valuable information about an individual's cognitive functioning. So, the Wechsler scale is the first IQ test that was made specifically for adults. And now they have one for teens and kids as well. And that's probably why it says, specifically. Clinicians use tests of personality to understand a person's thoughts, behaviors, and emotions. There's two forms of personality tests, the self-report and the projective test. Tests include the Minnesota Multifaceted Personality Inventory, MMPI, and the SCL-90, the NEO personality, and other specific self-report inventories designed to investigate specific disorders or research questions for which a general test may not be relevant. In projective tests, the examiner asks questions about an ambiguous stimuli. The most common are the Rorschach and the TAT. Behavioral assessments record actions rather than responses to rating scales or questions. The target behavior is what the client and clinician wish to change. Behavioral assessments include descriptions of the events that precede or follow the behaviors. In vivo observation takes place when clinicians record behavior in its natural context, such as the classroom or the home. Analog observations take place in setting or context such as the clinician's office or a laboratory specifically designed for observing the target behavior. In a behavioral self-report, the client records the target behavior, including the antecedents and consequences of the behavior. Self-monitoring is a form of behavioral self-report in which the client keeps a record of the frequency of specified behaviors. We're almost done with the summary. 2 more points. When psychologists conduct a multicultural assessment, they must take into account the person's cultural, ethnic, and racial background. This is my favorite one. Neuropsychological assessment is the process of gathering information about a client's brain functioning on the basis of performance on psychological tests. Clinicians use neuropsychological assessment measures to attempt to determine the functional correlates of brain damage by comparing a client's performance on a particular test with normative data from individuals who are known to have certain types of injuries or disorders. There are a variety of tests to assess verbal recall and auditory attention. Neuroimaging includes EEG, CT scan, MRI, fMRI, PET scan, and DTI. And that was chapter 4 on psychological assessments. So now I'm going to try to, reread 7 chapters worth of notes, and then I'm going to have my husband give me pop quizzes. And I think to study well, I may make videos on this, but both of my exams are tomorrow, and then, I don't know. So I'm going to review 4 chapters. Wait, 3, 4, 7. What? Let's see what I'm getting tested on tomorrow. So tomorrow I have a quiz on chapters 3 and 4 for my lifespan psychology class. And tomorrow I also have a quiz on chapters 2 and 3 of my abnormal psychology. So today I'm going to review 4 chapters. And by Sunday, I'll have to review 3 more, because I have an exam on chapters 1 through 4 for my lifespan class, and have an exam on chapters 1 through 3 for my abnormal psychology class. Next week's going to get really good because we're actually going to go into abnormal psychology. So, okay, I'll talk to you guys later. Thank you for watching and helping me study.